customized tools help you build your brand. Get the right tools at Shop.
Maybe there's something.
Close up and come back home.
So you quit your job and you go and rescue those kids.
South of that river is all rebel territory. No one goes in. What if this was your daughter? Sorry, man. She's gone.
Hear that? That's the sound of freedom.
Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Thank you for joining me today. We'll be looking at Visions of the Old World in Tartaria, Year Unknown. I was asked a couple questions by a few viewers about how could we possibly know what the old world or Tartaria really looked like. We have buildings here and there, we have larger buildings in the cities, we have some smaller buildings in the smaller cities and the towns and the rural areas that seem to have survived. But how do we really know what the old world in Tartaria looks like? Why is it important for us to have a vision of it? Do we have artistic renderings that we could use to get an idea of what it looks like? Is there a way that we could look at our current buildings to glean some sort of understanding of what this old world or what our world used to look like? Because we use the same principle when it comes to envisioning what the world looked like before. In our mainstream understanding of it, we use computer renderings to understand what the world looked like a million years ago, when we supposedly had dinosaurs roaming the world. But how could we use it to get an idea of what Tartaria in the old world looks like? Well, believe it or not, there is actually a way that we can do this, and we're going to explore that in this video. You may have seen this picture before. This was a picture that was supposedly compiled in the late 19th century, in the 1880s. I believe the date on it is 1886. And this is titled A Diagram of the Principal High Buildings of the Old World. Interesting, isn't it? they called this a diagram of the principal high buildings of the old world. Now, there's several things when we look at this picture that we could consider. Yes, we have some of the higher buildings, and at that time, the highest building or structure was supposedly the Washington Monument, which itself has a very interesting construction history, and not to mention 2 unique tones of granite, and also a lot of questions about its origin that has been covered extensively by other researchers. And this channel may well be diving into the Washington Monument and Washington, D.C. as a whole, because it's a very interesting place. But back on this current topic, we see that this seems to be a compilation of structures, but it's not just the highest structures. For example, towards the bottom, you see all the columns. We have Trajan's column right here, and I point out Trajan's column because I featured that in a comparison with the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Des Moines, Iowa, because the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Monument appeared just like another column, and it was actually taller than Trajan's column. And it was built, supposedly, only 10 short years after this picture was compiled. When you study all the structures in this picture, you have to wonder, why do they have the shorter structures that aren't even close to being the high buildings of the old world? You'd think they could just compile the grand cathedrals, Cologne, the pyramids, St. Paul, and what have you. Put it all together, and there you'd have a good diagram of the tallest buildings. This seems very, very busy, and it is an amazing list of buildings when you look at the bottom. But you have to wonder, was there some other reason for doing this? Was there some other reason for compiling this? Were these buildings that they were simply marking as buildings from the old world? Were these buildings already in existence, and all the buildings that were already in existence but didn't make this fine list and weren't depicted on it, those were the buildings that were not going to be of the old world, if you follow that theory? It's something very interesting to think about, because we have to put it in context. What would be the point of compiling a picture like this? It's beautiful, and it definitely gives you an idea of all the buildings together. And I've heard of more than one commenter stating that when they've seen this picture, they ask, well, what capital city is this? Or where in the world is this? Well, this is everywhere in the world. This is the entire old world, supposedly. But it's an interesting picture, and it brings up many interesting ideas. But I think the most important questions we have to ask revolve around, what was its true intention, and what can it tell us about the past, that which we understand of it? And does it give us an initial vision of the old world in Tartaria? And I would say that yes. Inadvertently, it does give us an idea of what a true old world Tartarian or old civilization city could have really looked like. The splendor, the grandeur, the remarkable artistic beauty. Every single one of these structures that you look at is just awe-inspiring and remarkable, and is world famous. And there's a reason for that.
Coffee with food? Not so fast. People always ask me, is coffee after meals healthy or bad for you? Actually, the answer is both.
We don't care.
As we go forward, I want you to remove all concepts you think you already know about these buildings. Forget what we think we know. We're going to try an experiment here. We're going to look at some buildings. There's going to be some artwork. There's going to be pictures of actual buildings. But when we do, we're all going to forget the location of the building. We're going to forget what nation state the building is located in. We're going to forget what culture the building is associated with. We are definitely going to forget the history, the story behind the building. And then we're also going to forget the construction techniques. We are going to let go of all that we already know so that we can look at these buildings as objectively as possible. Now, don't consider where this picture is taken from. Just consider what you see. Look at the structures that you see. Look at the layout of the landscape. Does this bear a striking resemblance to the picture that you saw at the start of the video, the title picture? And if it does, why is that? When you look at these buildings, what do they tell you? Do these just look like industrial buildings that were thrown up to facilitate some sort of action? Or was there something much deeper, especially where you look at where the water is flowing out? And don't think about where this is, just think about what you see. Only focus on what you see, focus on how the buildings look, and focus on the functionality of this scene that you see. And try to ask yourself, what's really being depicted here? What does this show? What can I learn as fact just by looking at this picture? What did the smokestack say? What did the height of the buildings say? What did the general layout and design of the buildings indicate? These buildings may not be all that impressive, and we could even say that some of these buildings look more like our modern buildings. But even in these buildings, I think we can see a little bit more, just in terms of the terrain that they're constructed on and what function they actually serve.
I think it might be
Now going back to this
desalination
compiled
plant.
picture that I had from the Why Do We Call It Tartaria
Desalination.
presentation earlier in the week. You look at all of these buildings, and now we're completely forgetting where they're located because it's irrelevant. Just look at the beauty and look at the similarities in each of the buildings. How they use arches, columns, pillars, and domes. Think about what that tells you about these buildings. We're not focusing on where they are. We're not focusing on what culture they're associated with, or what the nation state is, or what they even represent from the nation state. Just look at the actual building itself, and look at what that story tells you about each of these buildings, and think about what it would look like if you were in a city where all these buildings were together and that's all you saw. What would that tell you about that city? What would it be like to walk around that city and see that every day? Now, yes, we have the Royingyang Hotel here pictured, and it's interesting to me that they say it's one of the 20th century's greatest architectural failures. And I don't know why they consider it a failure. And you may know where this building is, but again, just let go of that. I only named it because it's hard not to know this building, and if you don't know this building, here are some other images of it. It's basically a giant three-sided pyramid-like building that towers over the landscape. Again, we're not concerned about where this building's located. We're not concerned about the construction techniques. We're not concerned that somehow, for some reason, they consider it a failure, even though if somebody built this building, they managed to build this building and it is standing. I consider that a success. It's just remarkable when you think about that overall. Now let's look at some pictures of what's called the steampunk era, or the steampunk genre. These are renderings, pictures, artwork. But do some of these pictures look like they could be real? Do some of these structures look like they could have existed? We do see some overlap with some of the domes and the use of columns and pillars. Now, a lot of people just say, well, this is fantasy and this doesn't reflect reality. But everything is derived from a concept, and a concept comes from the mind. And I believe that our imaginations do have some sort of link to giving us an idea of what our world looked like. We can't exactly explain it in scientific terms. You can consider it more of an intuition. But I know many people that I've talked to who, when they look at steampunk, they get that idea that there's something familiar about it, especially the buildings, especially the architecture. It's quite remarkable. This is actually a picture of Zanarkand from the game Final Fantasy X. I had a commenter who told me a couple of videos ago that they thought that the video games from the Final Fantasy era, the designers seemed to have some sort of understanding or awareness of what the buildings could have looked like. And you see a first-hand example of that here with just the unbelievable beauty and even the advanced technology that's mixed into it, just like it was in the steampunk genre. It's something to consider that buildings could look like this and someone could conceptualize this, and it was beautifully rendered. And remember, this was a video game.
Spice up your life with Hellman's Spicy Fried Chicken Sandwich. Start by tenderizing a half chicken breast in a plastic bag. Whisk buttermilk.
Now look at this building, and suddenly you realize, okay, maybe it wasn't so fantastical, because this is a building that really exists that you can really go to and you can actually look at. It exists, and this building seems like it's something from a fantasy. And again, we're not going to talk about what the building actually is, where it's located. If you're curious, you can ask me in the comments and I'll be happy to share with you. But for the purpose of this presentation, just take the building for what it is. Just view it visually. Think about being in a town or a city where these are the only kinds of buildings that you actually see. Now you go back to the steampunk era and you look and you ask yourself, well, wait a minute, okay, yes, this is all pretty. We've got some amazing technology here that just seems almost science fiction, if not out and out science fiction. But look at the buildings and look at the very large areas. And we always ask questions, why do we have some of these buildings, real buildings that we can interface with, that have this kind of space and this kind of terrain? Well, what kind of building would you be talking about where you'd have that kind of space? Well, here's one of them. And again, not going to talk about what building it is, and if you've watched my videos, you know what building it is, and if you want to know, ask me in the comments, but this is an example. Here you have the little doorways. Look at how tall and amazing and cavernous this building is, on both sides, and you ask yourself, well, what could be fitting in it? Could it be made for giants, like some people suggest? Well, can't disprove that. Or could it have been made for very large equipment? That's a possibility as well. And when you see a building like this, it's hard to deny that possibility. Now, here's another rendering on the left that someone would consider fantasy with large giant columns and a dome structure on the top of it. But believe it or not, we do actually have a real-life giant column that is over 140 feet tall that stands to this day that you can visit and see. So is this really that fantastical that this could exist? Is this really something beyond the realm of reality? Or is this inspired by something? Or could this even be a latent conscious memory or subconscious memory that suddenly made its way to the consciousness of the artist when they depicted this? And then the same thing with the picture on the right. Yes, it's a drawing, but could it have been real? Could it have existed? Was it possible? I believe that it could have been. Maybe not to that extent, maybe not that exact detail, but many of the inspirations from it you can see all over our current architecture. And then here's another one, and I'll just tell you that this building's a water tower. I'm not going to tell you where it is, and we supposedly have a construction photo with it on the right, but you can make of that what you will and make your own conclusions. It's an amazing building, and it has amazing detail in it. And again, just imagine being in a world where those are the only kind of buildings that you see. Whether you're in a small town or a large city, or whatever means of transportation that you take to move from city to city and town to town. And the Tower of Babel. Why do we always go back to the Tower of Babel? Well, there's a number of reasons. For one, there is a story that this was an amazing structure that was built in the old world. Now, some will say it was just a biblical story, but there are numerous references to it, and I think that it indicates much more than just a story about why we have different languages, although that's something interesting to think about, and that may warrant a video in and of itself. But nevertheless, the Tower of Babel was a remarkable structure that reached to the sky, and as anyone in architecture design would tell you, you either build a very narrow, tall tower, or you're basically building a large mountain of a building, and that's what this looks like. And the drawing on the left was always fascinating because it depicted many other buildings around the Tower of Babel that were quite amazing themselves, almost as though there was some other reset that occurred, which is why, in the Five Eras theory, we believe that the Tower of Babel and its remarkable structure and building was from the Golden Age, potentially the tail end of it, because it was clear that things were breaking down at that point. And yet, even to this day, we have architects, we have people who will conceptualize remarkable designs, and this is one of the most remarkable designs I've seen conceptualized is the Ultima Tower, something that was supposed to be built or proposed to be built in San Francisco. And it's interesting that the Ultima Tower, and you look at how tall it's supposed to be and how it dwarfs even the tallest structures, not just in height, but also in size. I mean, this is literally a building that is conceptualized to be the size of a mountain. It's remarkable. And you ask yourself, well, why would somebody conceptualize something like this? This is science fiction. This isn't reality. Well, with our current building materials that we know to be available, our glass, our steel, our cement, that doesn't quite work as well as the cement they used in the Pantheon, 2,000 years ago, but just don't ask any questions about that. Just accept it as it is. Just the fact that somebody conceptualized a building like this is remarkable, I think, because there's something within our minds that we somehow seem to have some sort of awareness of or connection to, that we did have amazing structures. And we think about the mountains that we see out there, or if you look at other researchers and their channels and how they propose what Devil's Tower could be. Is it a giant tree stump, or is it an old building? Could be either or, not sure. But there's a lot of illusions that great ridge lines and great piles of granite could potentially be the remains of megastructures, such as this conceptualized Ultima Tower, which was conceptualized in our contemporary era. It's just something interesting to think about, and it does give you yet another idea of what the old world could have looked like. And then, of course, this very interesting artistic drawing of many towers with elaborate features, many columns, many pillars. And again, we may think that this is just simply a work of fantasy or someone's wild imagination, but at the same time, think of all the Capitol buildings we've seen. Think of all the different types of buildings we've seen that show this amount of detail, that just seems so elaborate. And you ask yourself, well, why go to such lengths just for artistic pleasure? Well, the theory is there had to be something more to this with these buildings, that this was functional. Perhaps it was just building in this manner is what enabled these buildings to endure. And who knows how long a lot of these buildings have endured. But the construction techniques that we have not been talking about that were potentially employed had to be something beyond our imagination. Or it was a technology that we don't fully understand now, but we had in the past, something that nobody wants us to think or even consider. And of course, you'll see these old artistic drawings that show you ruins, especially from what we call the Roman Empire, etc. And you'll see it, oh yes, they had ruins even 600-700 years ago, and that's what they looked like. Well, how do we know for sure? And even if we had video footage, even if we had pictures, those could always be questionable as well. And of course, we know in our current era, what exactly do we have? Are we seeing something that's real, or are we seeing something that's generated by a computer program? It's one of the reasons why in my explorations, I always try to show buildings that truly exist, that you can go to and visit yourself, or I either try to use things that I know are real and combine them with things that I know are artwork that are produced by human beings. I think that's important, that the creative idea of what you see came from the mind of a human, because I believe that is the connection that we have to tap into if we're going to get an idea of what the visions of the old world and Tartaria could truly be.
Making healthy taste this good. Science did that.
Get back what you put in with Gatorade Electrolytes. Propel Fitness Water.
And then, of course, again, another conceptualized art of Rome. But again, we've seen all these details all over the place. And it's something that we need to continuously be aware of when we're doing our studies on these buildings. Just the similarity. And yet we're supposed to believe our accepted story that there was 1,000 years between some of the construction of these buildings. And yet, just by happenstance, they look so remarkably similar. I was shocked when I compared those pictures from the Iowa State Capitol in Des Moines to Trajan's Column in Rome. They really could have been on the same block. It was just remarkable. Yet there was over 1,500 years between the construction. It just didn't make sense, especially with the similarity of appearance. That did not make sense to me, and that does not make sense to me now. I believe our accepted story that there was, especially with the similarity. And I want you to think about what we were discussing with the larger buildings that may have existed in the distant past. You almost get the impression that this building is constructed here to draw attention to it, and yet to take attention off these amazing lines here in the rock. Now, of course, we'll be told these are erosion lines. It's natural wind and water erosion over a period of 1,000, tens of thousands, millions of years. Okay, fine. If that's what you want to believe, that's all right. But for me, it's hard to ignore just the lines, the vertical and horizontal lines that indicate that these potentially could be blocks. It almost looks like there is an old structure around this new modern structure that looks like it was just utterly glorious and remarkable. If it's just rock, well, then it's very pretty rock, and yet at the same time, it somehow almost has a artificial nature to it. It's hard to explain, but we see this in so many different places that we look. Last but not least, I just wanted to pull off 5 examples of the top 10 most beautiful buildings ever, and this was from the website www.enjoytravel.com. And it's interesting that all top 10 of those buildings were all old world buildings, and the 5 that I'd featured here are most certainly old world buildings. And it's just remarkable. And number 1, as I'm sure you can guess, and we'll drop our pretenses of pretending we don't know, the Taj Mahal. And you know when the Taj Mahal was built, and it's a remarkable structure, and it looks beautiful and pristine to this day. I think it's also very indicative of what our reality is, that in this travel website that we know is merely focused on an objective evaluation of beauty, the buildings they selected as the most beautiful buildings ever built were all old world buildings. Is that a coincidence? Or is there a reason for that? When you look at that, that is how you achieve visions of Tartaria and the old world. Well, thank you for joining me today. Remember, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Bad, huh? So, yeah, that's what's going on in the world. Is there's got these questions, and I know maybe just after one, it's hard to be like, yeah, I'm totally down with that. But I think we'll see that there's even more. Which one do I want to get to do? It's not that. This guy has some short ones. You know what? There was ones I wanted to see though. This kind of looks like an interesting one.
Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. Okay, let's do this.
The best way to burn fat and get shredded is not keto, paleo, it's not carnivore, it's not vegan, and it's definitely not super intense.
Howdy, everybody. Thanks for joining me here.
Archivist.
Another episode in the Radium series. Slowly becoming one of my favorite series. Kind of a little off pace. I know the Radium series is just kind of hopping over, and there's not a real consensus. And I'm just kind of sharing articles that I enjoy, showing you all the different fields in which radium was involved. And this is no different. This ties in with Fountain of Youth, the Elixir of Life, and things along those lines. But going through some of my mummy articles, I came across this one from a post of mine from many years ago, and I really wanted to do this one. So my plan was to dive into the sun, the origins of the sun, and our solar system, at least the solar system as we know it, and what radium looks like under a microscope, the connections people were making between cosmologies and the firmament, and what stars and meteors and all that stuff really were. Now, we will get into that, of course, but we got to cover this, or I'm going to cover this article first. And I think you'll enjoy it either way. So, yeah, your time is precious. Thanks for joining me as always. Let's get into the article. I'm short on time. Nothing new there. So, we're going to be efficient. We're shooting for 30 minutes on this video. Yeah, let's jump right in, huh? What do you think? This is from 1906, and it's called "The Missing Link Between Birds and Fishes is Found and Lost Again." Science, especially as regards its relation to the doctrine of evolution of species, suffered an irreparable loss recently at Benton on account of carelessness and neglect on the part of W. W. Willits. Several months ago, he received from a friend of his in Arizona the dried up mummy of what appeared to be some peculiar antediluvian bird or fish or combination of all, and inasmuch as the beast appeared to show on the surface of its terrible twisted shape both features and scales, he wondered if it might not be one of the missing links of evolution, the creature that was immediate between fishes and birds. Now, what's interesting here, too, is that if you look at the historical mentioning of dragons, they're often depicted with feathers and scales. So this is very interesting. And if you'll remember, or maybe you aren't familiar with my Anomalous America on an episode on Utah, we cover the only dragon skeleton ever found in the Americas, at least to my knowledge that I've uncovered, was found in Utah in a cave. It was 150 feet long, and it was sold to the Smithsonian. Back to the article. Determined to discover as much about it as possible, and being able financially to indulge his fancies, he prepared a mild solution of radium, and in this he soaked the mummy for several weeks. Gradually, the hard, leathery tissue of the creature softened and swelled. The twistings out and there developed the most remarkable find of all paleontological discoveries since the dawn of science. The animal which he had soaked out in the radium was both a fish and a bird. It had a curved, horny beak, much like that of the eagle, fitted out inside the jaws with teeth, like those of a pickerel. Its body was covered with scales, like those of a fish, and its shoulders, it had long, strong, feathered wings, while its tail also was provided with strong feathers. It had 2 feet, also with hooked claws. Mr. Willits was a happy man when the value of his find was fully disclosed, but the workings of his mind under the pressure of the great discovery showed with startling clearness how true it is that we are never fully satisfied, however fortune may design to bless us. His discovery was a marvelous thing, but it occurred to him how much more marvelous it would be if, perchance, by the application of a galvanic battery, he might be able to revive dormant life in the wonderful creature, and show an amazed world how Darwinian links used to comport themselves in the days of old. And so he did this. He arranged a powerful galvanic battery, attached to the poles thereof properly, to the birdfish, fish bird, or whatever the animal should be called, and turned the current on. Immediately, there was a great commotion in the vat of liquid radium. The creature thrashed about and uttered strange gurgling shriek like that of which Willits had never heard before. It swam violently to and fro for a few minutes, and then with a terrific splashing of the fluid and whirling of wings, it mounted aloft, dashed through the nearest window, and disappeared in the outer air. It is supposed that it fell to the earth again after flying about a mile, for an old hunter living that distance from Willits' place reports that the time the creature escaped, a scandalous looking animal came a flying along and flopped down in the yard, and I gin it to the dogs for supper. Mr. Willits is greatly shattered by the loss. Wow.
Helen Hadsell was able to win any competition she took part in. She was known as the contest queen because she had won 7 trips to Paris, boats.
Wow. So yeah, a little short. Obviously, one of those types of articles you want to go on for, forever and be a full pager, get some more details. But that's all we got. The missing link between birds and fishes, 1906. And you can, as you can see by the thumbnail here, why I chose this: the elixir of life and Frankenstein, radium, right? When you look into the history of the movie Frankenstein and what goes into the scientist, the mad scientist lab, and the imagery that we're used to, right? It's very interesting. There's a lot of very similar overlays here. And the Frankenstein story is from 1818, and the overlays are really interesting. I'm going to read the plot really quick from the actual movie from 1931, and funny the time frame too. If any of you haven't seen the original Frankenstein, it's it's kind of hard to watch, but it's interesting. And I'm just going to read you the plot really quick here from the movie. And it's interesting. In a village of the Bavarian Alps, okay. Now, Bohemia and Bavaria, some of the earliest experiments with radium were going on there in the 1800s, late 1800s. So no coincidence. Henry Frankenstein and his assistant Fritz, a hunchback, pieced together a human body. Some of the parts are freshly buried bodies, and some of the bodies of recently hanged criminals. In a laboratory he built inside a watchtower, Henry desires to create a human, giving his body life through electrical devices. He still needs a brain for his creation. At a nearby school, Henry's former teacher, Dr. Waldman, shows his class the brain of an average human being and the corrupted brain of a criminal for comparison. Henry sends Fritz to steal the healthy brain from Walt's class, but he accidentally damages it and so brings the corrupted brain. But the electrical connection, the kind of zombie state of the creature, the green liquid, there's often a green liquid. If you read the original, the modern Prometheus, the overlays are really interesting. If anyone isn't familiar with Prometheus and the narrative, it's, caveman fire. The original from 1818 is also very interesting, the book. But yeah, so I wanted to read that, and then we're going to hop over into a second article called Radium Revives Old Dreams. And you'll see as we go through this, the correlation and why I'm sharing these two together. But I really wanted to start with that one. Just love it. It's powerful to even imagine such an experiment. We've talked a lot about the mummies and the different things that they found, petrified bones, all these antediluvian animals, some very strange ones, very strange people as well. In the early 1800s, early mid 1800s. But yeah, I just thought that article read just like Frankenstein, and it was just too good of one not to leave or not to share with you guys. So the next one here, Radium Revives Old Dreams. This is from 1911. If you've watched any of my interviews with Dr. Longo, I've covered a similar topic, but not this exact article. So let's jump right in. Radium revives old dream. Science may discover in it the elixir of life which every age has sought. From the French Veterinary School at Alford comes the recent announcement that recent experiments with injections of radium into the veins of old horses have led the professors to believe that this wonderful element is to become the basis of a real elixir of life. An old horse into whose jugular vein were injected 4 milligrams of radium on 2 occasions began to show signs of rejuvenation. The animal became frisky, took on flesh, and was easily mistaken for a still young and valuable animal. Analysis of the blood showed an increased proportion of strong red globules. The whole animal, says Professor Gabriel Petit, who conducted the experiments, showed a surprising radioactivity, and the blood revealed the presence of considerable sulfate of radium. Without making or hinting of rash promises, the French scientists, who have been largely instrumental in the development of the now highly effective antitoxin serums. Now, doesn't that just ring like these Marvel, the comics, the old comics? I was very much into comics as a kid. And even the Hulk has a ton of overlays here. Captain America, it's endless. Many of these. The X-Men, yeah. Antitoxin serums announced their purposes in experimenting with horses. The action of radium on the animals was first to be observed, and if found beneficial, is revitalizing and rebuilding tissues. The professors were slowly to inoculate the horse with the mysterious new element until a radioactive serum might be drawn from its blood. Such a serum could be administered to the human being, as are the common smallpox and diphtheria vaccines today, in the hope that the tissue might be softened and revitalized, and the blood vessels held back from the stiffening process which comes on with advancing age. Now, what's really interesting too is, if you've heard me, I talked a little bit about this in the radium springs, and that radium with a medium of water, spring water, as the medium through which radium is induced into the body is very important. And that it also increases the blood cells, and it causes them to not only swell, but absorb more water. Now, also what's interesting is they were finding in experiments in the late 1800s that actually old age and wrinkling of the skin and the shrinking of the cardiovascular tissues is actually a slow dehydration. We're slowly dying of dehydration. The amount of the percentage of water in the body when you're born versus the percentage when you die is, I believe, somewhere it slowly goes down and degrades. And that with radium, they were able to rehydrate the human body. And that's exactly what's happening here with this horse. In other words, nearer to the expression desirable in a matter of so transcendent interest to man, radium, which already has upset half the notions of chemistry and led to the most advanced of scientists to believe that the age-old dream of transmutation of baser metals into gold may yet be fulfilled, is now likely to be held the principle of an elixir of life, the true font of perpetual youth. If in the end this is found to be true, the search of every age in history will have been crowned with success. The dreams of the Egyptian priests, the Grecian adventurers, the alchemists of the Middle Ages will have reached consummation, fruition, and man will have attained the glorious state in which we may kiss and quaff the golden drop. Nearly every known century has had its theory of perpetual youth and the means by which the state might be attained. The quest for elixirs, fountains, and wonderful fruits that might restore the fleet years have filled more pages of history, romance, and fable than any other single subject. Now, again, we're talking about fountains of youth, right? And you've heard me talk about fruits and vegetables as well, just like crystals. Not only were they experimenting with crystals and finding that crystals absorb radium light at different levels, they absorbed different vibratory rates of the radium. Now, remember, radium vibrates insanely fast, very, very fast. And it would impregnate these crystals, and these crystals would turn different colors. This is where the laser technology was coming from the early ages. And I believe that this is kind of some of the Atlantean tech I've mentioned. The overlays here, as well as they were testing some fruit, particularly citrus, in the early 1900s, and finding that a lot of the citrus family contained radium and iridium. So the orange, right, being the true apple of Eden, and the orange was one of the most sacred fruits given by kings and queens. I think this is a obvious notation that they were not only were finding radium in an orange, but the orange gets its color from radium. And the orange groves of Florida were growing along these radium springs. That's how they were watering these crops, with radium spring water. And that the Ponce de Leon stories tell of these tall natives in Florida that were living over 300 years old. And, Dr. Longo's done a great job of covering this. So if you haven't seen his work, make sure to check that out. But I've been talking about this too. Our paths crossed here mutually. So yeah, if you haven't seen any of our talks before, you should definitely check them out. The Fountain of Youth, Radium Springs. There's many. There's a few on my channel and a few on his. Chemistry itself is the science which grew out of the millennial search for the philosopher's stone, one of whose two properties was supposed to be this marvelous power. Even today, the fondest dream of every scientific mind is the discovery of some agency that will restore the aged tissue and prolong life. Only the wildest dreamers in the age of chemistry, now entertaining upon newer marvels, held that the elixir of life was still a possibility. Yet today, all the speculation is revived, and there are competent authorities who will earnestly contend that the dream is not necessarily fatuous. The reason for all this is patent. The restoration of youth is inspiredly tangled with the dream of heaven, the tenets of every religion. Immortality is but another word for the perpetual spring of life. The Greek Elysium was a region in which the happy rejoined the remembered loved ones, restored to the prime of youth, to dwell in a deathless life, ever young and ever fair. The Indian happy hunting ground, Nirvana, heaven, Valhalla, paradise, Eden, Arcadia, Hesperides, all carry this central thought. The fall of man, figuratively at least, cost him this blessing. The golden apples of the Hesperide gardens were supposed to restore youth and strength. Thus, eternal youth and eternal life are the mainstreams of thought running through the desert, the dearest beliefs of every age and race. Again, age and the approaching dissolution represent the supreme human tragedy. The greatest bait which the devil tempted the religious is the old days was the promise of restored youth. So the aged Faust, rich, famous, and wonderful, laments the absence of a jewel that would enhance them all, fresh youth to enjoy them. This the false power barters to him. Before anything was known of the sciences, men naturally conceived to restore of youth. to be some wondrous substance hidden in an obscure part of the world and closely guarded by some fearsome monsters. The highest exploits of the heroes were the recovery of these possessions. Yet, rationally enough, when the golden apples, or whatever they may have been, oranges, according to the various fables, were recovered, the possessor invariably violated some prescription of the bestowing power, with the result and effect was lost. Youth was never recovered. With the first observation of the mysterious power of drugs, especially the poisons which induce narcotic ecstasies of the mind, came the delusion that from these was to be found the elixir of life. Beginning the first centuries of the Christian era, these pursuits were followed in one way or another until a recent time. It is even probable that the first knowledge the Romans had of this theory was brought from the Nile, where it already was old, and there is reason to believe that the early Greek physicians harbored a similar ambition and worked at it. This gets really interesting because if you look into early Christendom and psychedelics, you'll find the mushroom at the core of this. And Allegro wrote a book called the Holy Cross, Holy Mushroom. So I may be getting that wrong, so I apologize if I am. But funny enough, that the phosphorescence and the mushroom and radium go hand in hand. Mushrooms are radiumized, and wouldn't that be part of the psychedelic effect? I would say so. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period, the work of the alchemists reached its height, and it continued to flourish independently, or as a side branch of chemistry, until within the last 100 years. For centuries, there was the delusion that the so-called philosopher's stone held the secret of perpetual youth, as well as the power of transmuting the baser metals into gold and silver. The precipitate or sublimate of this strange mythical substance in its full strength was supposed to transmute metals, and in weaker doses and infusions to restore youth. But there were many other theories of which the more persistent are still of interest. Geber and Roger Bacon believed that the secret of the elixir of life lay in aqua regia, a dream of liquid capable of dissolving all substances, especially gold. The aqua regis of today is, of course, a mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acid, and it does dissolve the purest gold, but was unknown to the alchemist. Or was it? We talked again about mythologies and these, these different gods being really just anthropomorphized and heroes created around these different chemicals, these different substances. And the atomic table being very much an overlay for some of these gods, and the radium and the god Ra, the sun god, the overlays there are endless. Both Geber and Bacon held that potable gold, that is to say, gold reduced to drinkable form, was the elixir of life, and centuries were devoted by these alchemists and their followers in efforts for dissolving of the yellow metal. Roger Bacon called the attention of Pope Nicholas IV to a story that an old man plowing in Sicily had found a small vial containing a yellow liquid. Thinking the substance due in being hot and dry under the errant sun, he had drank the substance and been immediately metamorphed into a young and radiant being. Somewhat later, about the time that wine drinking became universal in Europe, Raymond Lully advanced a theory that the basic spirit of the wine was the elixir of life. He called what we know now to note as alcohol aquavitate ardens, and held that it could be isolated. It would restore all who drink it to former states. When alcohol was distilled, the followers of this theory held that the alcohol was not the pure essence, but that it, in turn, contained the true elixir in minute quantities, probably the fusel oil. In this theory, there is again evident the inclination to regard the exciting and exhilarating drugs as youth restorers. Earlier dreamers had seen the probability in Bang, Hemlock, and Hellebore, which Lully felt the ravishness of wine and decided that it must have the properties of renewing life. Paracelsus and other alchemists tried out both of these theories. At a somewhat later period in Italy and France and Germany, the craze of alchemic investigation led to the dabbling in every manner of poison, with the result that what little knowledge had been gained was used for the most monstrous purposes. Ixili, the Italian chemist, furnished the original knowledge of poisons which enabled Madame de Brinvillers and her lovers to carry on their series of atrocities. Lavoisin and her crew of sorcerers and magicians, all poisoners of the worst kind known to history, based their work largely upon the traffic in drugs, which was one of the alchemists in her train prepared. The Black Mass, performed by another of her satellites, was another of the outgrowths of the passion of those days for the unknowable. Possibly the most romantic of all the dreams of perpetual youth was, however, excited on the occasion of discovering America. The name of him who went out to find it and the story of his adventures form one of the most alluring chapters of the earliest histories of the continent. Juan Ponce de Leon was governor of Puerto Rico when he heard from one of the Italian women on his plantation the tale of a wonderful island to the north of the Bahamas known as Bimini. Now, here's what's really interesting is that Bimini was actually what Florida, the peninsula of Florida, was named. Because Florida was most of the southern states. Florida was like everything west of the east of the Mississippi was known as Florida, all the way up to Canada and all the way to the Mississippi River, even into Texas and New Mexico was known as Florida. And that Florida, as we know it today,